Hello, those who have joined. Can you please give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Great, perfect. Welcome, welcome. We have a small group today, but we are just waiting for possibly a couple others to join. And while we do that, I would encourage you to take a moment to make sure that you've got your cell phones powered down, or at least things on vibrate, so that you're not distracted. If you need to put on your do not disturb on your email, I would encourage you to do what you need to do to allow yourself the time to really sink into the session and to be able to follow along and take lots of notes. I would also love to invite you to come on camera if you're comfortable with that. It just with a small group, especially, it makes it a lot more engaging and interactive when we can see each other. So if that is something that you're comfortable doing, I would absolutely love to be able to see others as well. And so again, we just have a couple others that are joining. As I mentioned, small group today, which is great. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to get some good engagement. Again, love to invite you to turn cameras on if that is accessible for you. Just makes it more engaging to be able to see each other and have some deeper, enriching engagement and conversations. We are going to be doing the session today is going to have a lot of interactivity, a lot of group discussion. And again, because we are a small group, I really want to make sure I invite everyone to take part in some of those conversations. It will really enhance your learning and get you as best prepared for this portion of the exam when you are working towards your CPC. So we'll hop into things as we wait for potentially a couple others to join. So my name is Jill Cantor. I had spent about 20 years in the staffing industry with Applin and around 12 years now, focusing on learning and development, about 10 years of training directly within the recruitment industry. I have also been delivering CPC training with ACSESS for about 7 years. And I'm really excited to walk you through this module. It has been completely revamped and modernized to reflect the realities of recruitment today. So I'm really excited to walk you through this revamp that I've just recently completed for Access. And you'll be the first one to see your eyes on it. Just a couple of quick notes before we begin. You will receive the slide deck after the session rather than before. So please do take notes as we go along. There will be a lot of information. There is a lot of slides and a lot of content to work through today. And some of the information that we cover today will really be helpful for that exam. And as I mentioned, the intention is for this to be really interactive with discussions. And so, again, keeping cameras on is always welcome. It does help that collaboration. And finally, just wanted to walk through what this session really is. This is not about recruitment tactics. This is about thinking like a professional recruiter. And in today's environment, recruitment is not defined by tools, but it is defined by judgment. But before we do that, I just wanted to invite you to share in the chat a little bit about yourself, how long you've been in the industry, what's your role, any specialties that you might have, your current location, and then just one thing that you love about recruitment. So we'll take a minute for everyone to engage in the chat. How long you've been in the industry, what's your role, where are you located, and what's one thing you love about the industry? So 2 years, Montreal, legal and compliance. Marina, 20 plus years, Edmonton, industry is never boring, changes every day. What about a couple others there? Michael, 4 years, Toronto, junior operations manager, something new every day. Right. Like Rowena says, it's never boring. Just when you think you've seen it and you've seen it all, something new comes up, something interesting, something engaging, something that makes you pause, stop in your tracks. Okay. And anyone else? Again, there was a couple others that might be joining in. All right. So just to start off with a little bit of an engagement question here, just to really ground in this particular session. So here I'll invite you to use the little hands up features or the thumbs up features as we go through this, but just some questions just to really get grounded in this reality. And then we'll go line by line and we'll kind of narrate some patterns. And so let's see what pops up here for you. And so can you relate to this? A client change requirements mid-search. So if so, give me the thumbs up. Okay. Let's see what else here. We've got, oh, bear with me there. Little tech. It's got to remove something on here. Okay, so how about a candidate ghosted after accepting an offer? Okay, I'm sure that's something that we all see. You've competed against 5 agencies for one role. And AI perhaps complicated some screening. Is that something that you've navigated? So when we think about some of the different challenges that come up, and the reason why I want to start off with some of these questions is really to understand where we want to create some different parameters, where we look at things from our own judgment standpoint, and some of the ways that we operate, some of the ways that we communicate with candidates, some of the ways that we communicate with clients. And when we're thinking about things like, for example, if a candidate ghosts you after accepting offer, well, maybe there's an idea there that that's trust fragility in a competitive market. If you raised your hand or gave me a thumbs up competing with multiple agencies, well, maybe that's this idea of margin compression and speed pressure. So we're looking at some of the different parameters of what we're navigating every day. And if you've been navigating all of this, what you're experiencing is not randomness, it's just systemic pressure. And so here we are shifting what we're talking about today from an emotional frustration to some analytical reframing. So what exactly are we going to be covering today? Today, when we look at our session roadmap, we're going to be looking at a few things. We're going to be looking at the landscape, like what is happening in the market today, what's changed. We're going to look at sourcing, just some basic discussions around sourcing. The session today is not a recruiting how-to. It is not a sourcing how-to, but we're going to look at how the fact about how sourcing, when we think about expanding it intelligently, not randomly, it might give us stronger results. We're going to look at screening. So that idea of being structured but defensible evaluation is what we're looking at today. We're going to look at ethics. We're not going to dive into it deeply because I know there's other workshops through CPC that dive much deeper into ethics, but it's really about this idea of navigating the gray zones professionally. And then we're going to talk a little bit about advisory and that idea of advisory positioning. So influencing without overstepping. And so when we take a look at all of these, we're just really looking at the whole picture, particularly when it comes to the modern recruiter and when it comes to recruitment practices and recruitment strategies or strategic recruitment. And so in chat, I would love for you just to think about, without having shared a lot of insight of what we're going to be looking at in each of these areas over the next 3 hours. But if you were to strengthen just one of these areas this year, one area, is it understanding the market better? Is it understanding different sourcing and expanding that? Is it really creating defensible screening? Is it focusing on ethics and integrity? Is it becoming that advisor? So influencing candidates and our clients without overstepping. So if you were to lean in or strengthen just one of these this year, which one do you think personally would expand your results or impact your results the most? So screening, advisory, sourcing. Okay, so a little blend of everything. Okay. And so, again, for this session, we're not going to go into a deep dive on the how-to of these. This is introducing some reframe, maybe a little bit of mindset shift, maybe a little bit of an open mindset or a growth mindset versus fixed mindsets that maybe we've always done things a certain way. Therefore, why do I need to make an adjustment? Before hopping into other areas of those sessions, we want to just go back, dial it back a little bit, and have a bit of a reminder on what are we doing here, right? As Access, what does Access offer? And so as members, I'm just going to read this off, and this is important to be able to remember some of these things, just as a hint, hint, nudge, nudge, as you're working through your studies for your CPC exam. But as members of the Association of Canada Search, Employment and Staffing Services, we commit to uphold this code of ethics and standards and to display it prominently in our place of business. We support the principles set forth below and acknowledge that compliance with these principles is in the best interest of Access members, companies, their candidates, employees, client organizations, and the reputation of the search, employment, and staffing services profession in Canada. So then what is the overall mission of Access? And so I've created a condensed slide here. I do encourage you to spend a little bit of time looking at the ACSESS website. There's so many different areas, and to really understand the mission and to understand certain protocols and things that are set in place and recommendations. But generally speaking, the ACSESS mission is to promote the interests and growth of the Canadian recruitment and staffing industry. So what will ACSESS do? Access will identify and communicate and monitor the industry, standards, different ethical practices that happen. It will positively influence and protect the regulatory and business environment that impacts our members and the people that they serve. Access will also promote credibility and visibility of the industry to the business community, government, and general public, as well as providing our members, so the members of Access, with strategic support services, programs, and tools to assist them in achieving their goals and their objectives. So just wanted to highlight that a little bit so that you have a little bit more of an understanding if you're newer to Access or haven't spent much time kind of navigating what they really do and what Access is really about. Just a little bit of an introduction. And again, there's a plethora of information and resources and tools on their website. So let's take a little bit of a deep dive here and thinking about the industry. Again, as I mentioned, I was in the industry for 20 years, and during that time, wow, did it ever change. I went from literally probably opening up the yellow pages and the white pages to contact candidates and clients to then LinkedIn showing up, and now we're in this world of AI. And AI is here to stay. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that today, but what a wild ride it's been. And so I want you just to take like 30 seconds. Just think about this month. We're only 4 days into this month, but think about last month, February, and think about what moments made you say recruitment is wild. Like what made you think or say or feel, wow, this is a wild ride. And so I want you to think about that for a few seconds and then maybe just type some things in chat. And I've kind of put some examples on the screen here, but we'll look at that. But just to kind of ground us in this, what is happening in this landscape today? Anything that made you pause or shake your head or go, wow. So I'll give it a few seconds for you to share in the chat. And also, you're welcome to raise your hand too, because hearing people share is even more engaging than the chat itself. Okay, so made an offer to a candidate and they ghosted us. Okay, that can happen. What else made you think, wow, this is just wild times? Right? So as you're thinking that, maybe it is about the speed of which things are happening. Maybe it is about the competition, that fierce competition, and it's not just other agencies that you're competing against, right? It's AI, it's internal resources within our clients' organizations. Maybe there's certain things around salary mismatch, speed pressure, again, that AI distortion. Maybe it's candidate volatility. Maybe it's client ambiguity. Maybe it's just offer collapses, right? Like where we're going to put into the chat, just offers or candidates ghosting. And so when we really take a look at this, we're noticing that these aren't just solved by working harder. This is not about working harder, because I'm sure many in the recruitment industry are already working exceptionally hard. This is really about working differently. And that is really the key pivot here, is this idea of working differently, not necessarily harder. And so today is really about working differently. And let's look at a bit of a macro reality. So we're now in 2026. Candidates compare recruiters like vendors. Clients benchmark agencies on responsiveness. AI has compressed sourcing advantage. Fraud has increased suspicion. And so as I'm sharing things, I'm welcoming you to give a thumbs up in the chat if some of these are landing. Complexity increased again, expectations increased, scrutiny has increased. So this really elevates the wildness of what's happening in recruitment compared to when I started many years ago. Brenda says the complexity of trying to screen against candidate fraud while respecting and adhering to privacy laws. Yeah, that adds a whole other layer as well. Thank you. So let's talk about understanding the modern recruitment environment. Recruitment's changed, so your strategy must change with it. That's a reality. Recruitment's changed, so our strategies need to change. And so before we really talk tactics, we really want to think about context. And so if you misdiagnose the environment, you will misapply strategy. I'll say that again. If you misdiagnose the environment, what's happening around you, the world that we're in, right? The business world, the candidate world, the recruitment world, you will misapply your strategy. And so the market today is not just competitive, although it is. But again, as I mentioned, it's compressed, it's transparent, and it's highly technology accelerated. And so in this section, we are going to clarify what has actually changed, what is changing, what continues to evolve, and will keep doing so, and what that means for you as agency recruiters as well in today's environment. And so when you think about the recruitment landscape today, again, you're going to hear us talk or hear me talk a lot about technology. And so there's that technology acceleration, like at lightning speed. And I kid you not when I said that when I started, I literally, if anyone remembers the white pages and the yellow pages, like the big giant books that were sitting on my desk at that time. So has it ever changed? And the biggest mistake that recruiters make is thinking the market is just tighter. So while the market might feel tighter, it is not just tighter, it is structurally different. And so we're going to expand some of this and take a look at what this means. And so the candidate leverage has increased. Candidates are comparing shopping, right? They're doing comparison shopping of companies, of recruiters. They scrutinize, right? How many times have you sent out emails or people on your team have sent out messages within LinkedIn and not heard back? It's because they're scrutinizing. They are researching recruiters, right? Candidates are researching recruiters. They expect transparency about pay, about flexibility, about process. And so if your outreach doesn't include clarity about the role, if your outreach doesn't talk about compensation bands or response, that response rate will ultimately drop. And so AI has lowered sourcing barriers. Everyone has access to automation tools. So this is not new that one company has access to AI or different tools because people can get AI for free. Some companies might have deep, deep, deep tools that are built into their systems, but everyone has access to automation tools, which means sourcing advantage is shrinking. That messaging of we can source the fastest is shrinking. And so when everyone has the same tools, right, one may look a little bit different than the other, but differentiation moves to judgment. Clients face higher accountability. So hiring managers are under pressure, right? They're under pressure from various sources. They're under pressure from budget oversight, DEI compliance, legal scrutiny, retention metrics. So that means that clients are becoming more cautious. Recruiters must present defensible candidates. Competition is more visible, right? So LinkedIn. I remember when LinkedIn first came out, this is like the greatest thing since sliced bread. But it's changed over the years. So LinkedIn transparency becomes even more critical if you're utilizing LinkedIn as a source. So LinkedIn transparency means candidates see job reposting, clients see multiple agency activity, agencies see each other. So this feeling of opacity is gone, right? That's changed. And trust is more fragile. And so reference impersonation fraud is continuing to be on the rise, right? So reference scams, reference fraud, that continues. Candidates are weary, clients are risk adverse. Trust now really, really requires intentional signaling. And so we're going to kind of delve into some of this. But in this year that we're in 2026 and beyond, your job is not just to find talent. Your job is to reduce uncertainty. And when we think about that your job is not just to find talent, it is to reduce uncertainty, that switches from recruitment to almost executive level framing. And to delve into this a little bit further, what's changed? So again, transparency, acceleration, scrutiny. Right? It has become more exposed, it has become faster, it has become accountable. And so these three shifts explain most of the tension that recruiters are feeling today. So I'd love to hear in chat if you were to look at what has really, in your realm or your experiences, when you think about what's changed that equals tension that recruiters are feeling today, is it that idea of needing more, that further transparency, the speed of which things are happening? And so let me explain these all, and then scrutiny. So which of the three? So transparency, right, has fundamentally altered power dynamics in recruitment, right? So information transparency, candidates now know want to know, right? They need to know salary benchmarks, company reviews, interview experiences, who else is hiring. Clients want to know market salary data, agency comparisons, how quickly competitors are filling roles. So recruiters are no longer in control of information flow. That is a structural shift. So perhaps in previous cycles, recruiters were information gatekeepers. Today, recruiters are information navigators. Again, the difference, recruiters were information gatekeepers at times, but now information navigators. That's professional reframing. There's also process transparency. Candidates expect clarity on, again, all those things. So again, salary, interview stages, decision timelines, feedback quality. So if your process is vague, it creates distrust. And so let's take a look at acceleration, right? As I'm reading through these, which one jumps out at the most for you that you're feeling that creates tension? Acceleration, this is not just about speed, it's about compression, right? The compression. Technology compression, AI tools accelerate resume parsing, sourcing, outreach, screening summaries. But acceleration compresses expectations. So if sourcing is faster, clients expect faster results, right? If we're touting faster sourcing, they expect faster results. So if resumes are AI polished, screening becomes harder. So acceleration increases output, but it also increases noise. There is also decision compression. Candidates accept offers quickly, withdraw quickly, and they also enter bidding wars quickly. Clients want shortlists faster. They're escalating their urgency. So when we increase speed, we risk things that can break down the structure. So when the speed increases, there's a risk of structure change alongside it. And then the last one here, scrutiny. This is the most important circle for CPC alignment, for your alignment with your CPC. So a scrutiny has increased at every level of the recruitment process. I'm going to break that down. So there's legal and compliance scrutiny. We're not going to deep dive into that because if you haven't already, you'll be taking some sessions on that for the CPC. But that talks about human rights awareness, bias mitigation, DEI accountability, documentation expectations, hiring decisions need to be defensible, not just good, but defensible. Organizational scrutiny. Hiring managers are facing those budget reviews, those retention metrics, leadership questioning. So every hire is under review. And that pressure flows to you as the ones in the recruitment agencies. And last, candidate scrutiny. Candidates evaluate everything. So does the process feel respectful? Maybe whether salary discussions are actually transparent, whether feedback is truly meaningful, whether they're even getting feedback. So one poor experience with a candidate can damage your brand. And so when we're integrating these three, right, transparency increases visibility, acceleration increases pressure, and scrutiny increases accountability. So I'll go back to my original question. Of these three, which one do you feel is tying in a deeper sense of tension? Which ones do you experience the greatest level of tension? Scrutiny, acceleration, so that pressure, right? Scrutiny. Okay. And so, what about this concept as well? That can add another layer of tension is candidates as decision makers. So if transparency has increased, candidate leverage has increased. Candidates have more information, they have more options, they have more ability to walk away quickly. And so this really isn't about candidates being difficult. This is about the market giving candidates more choice and more visibility. So I want to set that frame here, right? So candidates are not just choosing roles. Again, this is not meant to be blanket. There's obviously going to be different situations and circumstances and based on the role and based on the candidates and all that stuff. But candidates are not just choosing roles. They are evaluating risk. They are assessing whether the opportunity, number one, is it real, right? Because of all of the fakeness happening out there, is the opportunity real? Whether the employer will follow through, whether the process will be respectful, and whether the recruiter is credible, right? And so let's look at this a little bit, right? So compare opportunities more actively. That's something that they're doing, is comparing them more actively. They're comparing more than just job titles. They are comparing work arrangements, leadership styles, workload, growth potential, stability, location, right? Remote versus in person or a blend of both. Right? They're also comparing how roles are presented. So if two opportunities maybe are similar, the differentiator often becomes the clarity and the confidence in the process, not the role itself. So for example, maybe a candidate may have two offers that look similar on paper, The one they accept is often the one with clearer communication, fewer surprises, and a recruiter who feels grounded and trustworthy, right? So they're going to look at the offers and go, well, which one has had better communication? Maybe there are fewer surprises, so they know what they're getting into. Maybe they receive frequent outreach, right? And I'm sure candidates nowadays are getting inundated with, and it's been going like that for a long time, but inundated with outreach. Strong candidates receive frequent outreach, often from multiple agencies, internal recruiters. They're getting it in their LinkedIn, they're getting it in their emails, they're getting it on their cell phones. I'm getting texts often from just random inviting me to apply to a job. I never click on those because I don't trust them, but that comes up. So it changes the dynamic. You are not competing only on access to roles, but you're competing on relevance. You're competing on specificity, and the quality of the experience that you are creating. And there's a really important nuance here. High outreach volume makes candidates more selective, not more available. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit too, that generic messages blend together. Generic messages blend together. So personalization truly will matter, but it needs to be efficient. So we're going to talk about that. Again, expecting transparency, transparency, transparency. Candidates expect it about everything. When recruiters withhold information, when they're staying vague, candidates fill in the gaps themselves and often assume the worst. And then, as I've mentioned and indicated, they evaluate recruiters. Candidates evaluate recruiters, not just the roles. So they are assessing credibility through signals like how specific your message is, whether you communicate from a professional domain, whether you can answer questions clearly, whether you respect boundaries and consent. So these are just nuances to be thinking about when you're engaging with candidates and recognizing that they have become powerful decision makers of this process. And so I want to ask the question of the group is what makes you, right, when you think about getting messages, or if you were to get a message, let's say in LinkedIn or a random text about an opportunity, what would make you personally ignore a recruiter message? Remember, candidates are decision makers. They can choose to respond or not. And so if they're getting messages, what would make you as a person ignore a recruiter message? You can type that in chat or share if you wanted to come online and share, but what would make you ignore a message? So I'll give it a few seconds to share in chat. Generic AI messaging, right? If you could tell it's been crafted in ChatGPT and it's generic. I get lots of emails that sound very ChatGPT and I just delete them myself often. What else? If I don't know them or hadn't spoken with them before, or if their profile on LinkedIn, right, if it was dubious, right? Please, if everyone has a LinkedIn profile, which I'm sure you all do, make sure you've got a photo and it's set up properly. If I feel the message is generic and spent to multiple people with no specific mention of my skills, right? Even my daughter, who's 19, gets the strangest random suggestions of jobs on Indeed, right? Clearly has not looked at her profile, right? So that we all experience, and as our candidates do. So we don't want to do that, right? We want to think about how do we become clearer, and we'll talk about that briefly. But also just to bring back this messaging that we've already introduced, that the client side is under pressure. And so while candidates have become more decision makers, while candidates have gained and will continue to gain leverage, clients have gained that idea of further accountability as well. So the pressure doesn't disappear, it's just shifted. And so if the previous slide was about candidate agency, not a recruiting agency, but like their agency themselves. This really balances that narrative because recruiters sit in the tension between empowered candidates and constrained clients. So when we're dealing with candidates that are more empowered and we have clients that are more constrained, then that's where the tension can arise. And so clients are not necessarily difficult, but they're constrained. Hiring decisions are under intensified scrutiny. When a hiring manager pushes for speed or resists salary flexibility, it is often not necessarily from a place of impatience. It is pressure flowing downward from leadership, finance, compliance, or retention concerns. And so your role is not necessarily to react emotionally to pressure. Your role is to diagnose this restraint behind it. So it's not to react emotionally to that pressure that comes down, right? That ends up flowing through you. It's to diagnose what is the constraint behind it. And so when we look at budget sensitivities, right, they're tighter. Salary bands are reviewed more frequently. Hiring managers may be asked to justify every incremental dollar. And so when a client says, we can't go above this number, it may not be stubbornness. It just may be structural. And so as a recruiter, if we think about advisory and that advisory role that we can lean into, maybe a response back might sound like, and again, this is here where I encourage you to take notes, but a response back may sound like, based on current market movement, comparable roles are closing 10 to 15% higher. We can explore scope adjustments, timeline extensions, or a revised range. Which lever feels most realistic internally? Right? So it's kind of taking an advisory role. If you're not pushing back emotionally, you're presenting options. Board oversight. Some organizations, depending on the size and the scope of the organization, now require, well, I shouldn't say now, but have often always required, but even more so now, executive level approval for certain hires. And that slows timelines, that increases caution. Recruiters need to anticipate this and build it into expectations. So you might say, what internal approvals does this role require so we can plan timing accurately? Right? This is preventing surprises when you're working with clients or when somebody on your team is working with clients if it's not you directly. So what internal approvals does this role require? So again, we're trying to understand rather than being caught off guard at the end, right? Just that's a kind of a diagnostic rather than a reactive response. Retention anxiety. Clients may fear hiring someone will leave in a year, right? Especially if you're looking on maybe more of that direct hire, that perm type recruitment contract, long-term contract, whatever that might look like. So that fear can drive conservative decisions or overly rigid criteria. And so when the client has that retention anxiety, maybe a reframe is what indicators would increase your confidence in long-term retention. So what indicators would increase your confidence in long-term retention? So now you're helping them potentially as an advisor to define stability, not just filling a seat. What does stability look like? Legal exposure, DEI compliance, right? Here, hiring managers are aware of bias risk. They may hesitate to articulate preferences clearly. And so here you're really protecting them by structuring the process. So an example of what one might say is let's anchor criteria to competencies. So how do we anchor the role or candidate criteria to competencies and the documented job requirements? And we'll talk a little bit later how that links back to reducing risk. Because then we get into that ethics and you get into that integrity and you become an advisor to the client. And that's where we start to differentiate in this wild world of recruitment, where everyone has access to faster tools, to AI, to increased sourcing methodologies. The difference that becomes is, Are you an advisor to help remove judgment and mitigate risks for the client? Or are you sending resumes only as that? So this is where you start thinking about that difference. And we're going to start looking at this idea that your job is not to react to pressure, but to, again, diagnose that constraint. And as I've said, that's truly advisory positioning. Recruiters who diagnose constraints can influence outcomes, or at least have a better chance of influencing outcomes. Recruiters who react to pressure get compressed by it. So I wanted to ask you, what is the most unrealistic client expectation you've faced recently? What's the most unrealistic client expectation that you've faced recently? And we've all had them. So what would that look like for you? The most unrealistic client expectation you have faced recently. And again, this is just tying it back to awareness that everyone will get those challenges. They might look different. They might be about budget. They might be about board oversight. They might be about anxiety. They might be about legal exposure. But what is the most unrealistic expectation you have faced recently? And for some, maybe it's unrealistic salary expectations. Maybe it's the unicorn candidate profile. Maybe it's impossible timelines. Maybe it's immediate availability. Maybe it's relocation resistance. So what are those things that you have recently seen, heard, or experienced? So I'll give you a few seconds to include something in the chat. There's any examples? Let's see. They awarded a contract to 47 vendors and expected that the vendors will all want to work on their roles. Wow. Okay. That's insane. That's insane. 47 vendors. Like that to me is an example of highly, um, yeah, high expectations. Okay. Well, if anyone wants to continue to share in there, we will carry on. And so before we get into AI, just again to kind of bring this a little bit home here is that increased competition. So we've talked about this competition. So global talent pools, saturation of job boards, harder differentiation on things. And so when transparency and AI lowered access barriers, the competition intensified. And so this is a structural consequence, not a coincidence. This is a structural consequence, not a coincidence. So the same tools that made sourcing easier for you also made it easier for everyone else, right? So it's like, great, these tools are awesome. How exciting. But it made it easier for everyone else as well. And so access is no longer truly the differentiator. Again, some tools may be stronger or more robust or more powerful than others. Some CRM systems or ATS systems maybe have deeper range. They might have way more candidates in them than others. But basically speaking, access is no longer the differentiator. And so access to LinkedIn Recruiter, widespread, right? That's not a selling point anymore. AI sourcing tools are widely available, not a selling point. Job boards are saturated, definitely not a selling point. Remote work has expanded geographic reach for all. And so if everyone is fishing in the same digital lake, right? If everyone is fishing in the same digital lake, the size of the net no longer determines success. So what does? If the size of the net no longer determines success, what does? You can type one word. If just one word comes to mind, what differentiates? If everyone has access to that same wide net, some tools might be slightly faster, but everyone has access to tools. So what here determines success? Just a one word. Relationships. Okay. We've got a few others here. Who else wants to? Money. Okay. Brenda's saying money. Anyone else? Well, those could both hold true, efficiency and process, right? So the relationships, money, efficiency and process. So while all of those can be true, judgment, right? At the end of the day, judgment is what really can determine success. What I mean by that. Okay, so when we're looking in previous cycles, competitive advantage came from, right? So in previous times, competitive advantages came from exclusive networks, from geography access, information asymmetry. Now, right, talent is visible, roles are visible, agencies are visible. And so candidates often receive outreach, as we already know, from multiple recruiters for the same or similar roles. They are often being contacted at multiple times, right? Not just once or twice, but in that example that Rowena gave, that 47 vendors. So imagine candidates, the same candidates being inundated by all those agencies. And so I just want you to imagine, right, from the candidate perspective, if you received 5 similar messages in 1 week, how would you choose who to respond to? Same message, 5 times in the same week for the same thing. How would you decide which one you may respond to? Right? And so this is really where differentiation matters. Differentiation will depend on relevance, right? How specific they are, the credibility, process clarity, advisory confidence. So it's not about volume. It is not about speed alone. It is not access. And so when volume is easy to scale, like volume has become easier and easier and easier to scale, but judgment is not. So I just want to let that land. Volume is easy to scale, judgment is not. So maybe in the real world, right, 2 recruiters contact the same candidate. So recruiter A, right, maybe types up something in LinkedIn. I came across your profile and think you'd be a strong fit for a client of ours. Sounds pretty, right, common. Recruiter B, I noticed you led an SAP migration across 3 manufacturing sites. Our client is beginning a similar transition and struggling with stakeholder alignment. Would you be open to a confidential conversation? Right? That difference is not access because every recruiter can find that same candidate like that. The difference is discernment, right? So it's not just sending out that same, I came across your profile in a bulk to 100 candidates. It's the individualization. Yes, it takes more time without a doubt, but the difference is discernment. It's not access. And so when you identify, right, when everyone has access, right, when we realize that everyone has access to the same talent pools, advantage really shifts from that access to that judgment, that discernment. So I just want to let that sit for a bit, right? Everyone has access to the same talent pools. What's the difference is your discernment, your judgment, and your approach to that. And this is really where that identity shifts from talent finder to talent advisor. While yes, the job you get paid to, you get bonused on, you get commission on finding and placing talent, 100%. But from the perspective, it's where the identity shifts from talent finder to talent advisor. And so I just want to add one more layer to that before we go on to AI a little bit, is increased competition here also means that, as I've already alluded to, candidates compare recruiters, clients compare agencies, performance metrics are visible, brand reputation travels quickly. So that means that a poor outreach, unclear communication, and weak screening damage really damages the positioning faster than before. And so access is really common, as I've said, and you'll hear me say it again. Interpretation is rare. Access is common, right? These are good things to be writing your notes on, but access, I'm not talking about the organization access, but access to candidates is common. Interpretation is rare. Again, most recruiters can reach the same talent pools, but the advantage really comes from how well you assess, how well you advise, and how well you position the right match. So I'm going to tie in a little bit of the CPC here. And so under competitive pressure, shortcuts become tempting, right? This is where shortcuts become tempting because of that compression and that speed and that acceleration. But this is precisely when structure and ethical discipline matters the most. And so, because to wrap up the slide, because competition is no longer about who we can find, it is about who can interpret the candidate, who can evaluate, who can present talent more intelligently. And some of this will lean into other slides that we get into a little bit further. And to lean in now a little bit deeper into AI and human judgment. And again, this is where things are changing like lightning speed. And when competition intensifies, when speed increases, when technology naturally moves in, right? That's where that competition is going to get intense, right? But the technology is naturally going to move in here. And why? So AI has lowered friction in recruitment, yes, right? But lowering friction is not the same as improving judgment. So what do I mean by that? I'm just going to take a moment here just to see if anyone wants to type into chat or you want to raise your hand and speak directly. AI has lowered friction in recruitment, meaning it's faster to find people. But lowering friction is not the same as improving judgment. So what does that mean? Lowering friction is not the same as improving judgment. Anyone want to type in a couple of words? Any thoughts? Well, I'm going to share a couple of things on the slide here. So if anyone is typing into the chat as I do that, please do so. But I'm going to share with you a little bit around what that could actually mean. So if I set the frame clearly, we're going to take a look at some of the things here that come up. And so where has it actually landed? So AI has changed a lot of things, as we've already discussed, right? The speed has been improved. The volume has been improved, right? It increases volume. It increases pattern recognition. And so the human judgment here is really what will differentiate. This is not an anti-AI slide, but this is a governance slide. So it's increased speed, it's increased volume, it's increased pattern recognition. And so here AI is a force multiplier. It magnifies whatever process you already have. And if your process is structured, AI enhances it. If your process is unstructured, it amplifies the unstructuredness. It can become really intense if you don't operate in a structured way. AI will improve it, enhance it, elevate it. But if your overall process on whatever that process may be for any areas of your recruitment, if it's unstructured, right, poorly navigated, if it's a fly by the seat of the pants process, AI is going to amplify that. It's going to make it even more stressful. And so, what can AI do here? So, if we look at this first layer of what it can do well, so yeah, it can parse resumes at scale. It can surface keyword alignment. It can generate outreach drafts. It can summarize screening calls. It can identify patterns in large data sets. And that is efficiency. And so AI increases volume and speed, and that's real value. So this is not to diminish it. But the downside is where AI cannot replace judgment. AI cannot interpret nuance in motivation. It cannot detect subtle misalignment in leadership style. It cannot assess political intelligence, like right nuance. It cannot elevate cultural risk thoughtfully. It cannot negotiate emotional hesitation. It most certainly cannot negotiate emotional intelligence. That is highly sought after in a lot of organizations, that people are emotionally intelligent when it comes to being in the workplace, no matter the role. And so AI cannot do these things. And so if a candidate says, I'm open to opportunities, well, AI reads that availability. A recruiter hears hesitation, right? AI reads availability. I'm open to anything, basically. A recruiter hears hesitation. That's judgment. And so then the third layer here is the hidden risks. And so this is where you elevate. And so if AI introduces scale bias, if AI prompts, let's say, dependency or false confidence, right? These are the things that AI can introduce as the hidden risks, right? There's that scale bias, that prompt dependency, false confidence. So I'm going to explain those to you. What does that mean? What does scale bias mean as a risk? And so if the training data reflects past hiring patterns, it may reinforce those patterns, right? If there's data that reflects past hiring patterns, it may reinforce those patterns. If historically a company hired mostly from one educational background, AI may over prioritize similar profiles and you miss out on other candidates. You remain accountable. Prompt dependency. So the outreach quality depends heavily on input clarity. So if your search engine criteria are vague or you're not an expert at AI prompts, right? It can become the fact that your AI output could become vague. And so AI does not correct weak thinking. And then the last one here is false confidence, right? These are some of the risks of AI. False confidence. Because AI outputs look polished, recruiters may overtrust summaries, and you really must still verify. So let's say you put in interview notes, you put in a resume, and you want to create something to send to a client, right? You always have to verify. So something that might have a polished output does not equal accurate evaluation. So I wanted to say this very clearly before we move on. If you cannot explain, this is really important, and you should write this down. If you cannot explain why a candidate was shortlisted without referencing the tool, you do not own the decision. So if you cannot explain why a candidate was shortlisted without referencing the tool, you do not own the decision. So this is a strong line, and it also aligns with CPC standards. Liability does not transfer to the software provider, right? So you really want to think about liability does not transfer to the software provider. It transfers to you. So that reinforces your responsibility of using AI properly. Okay, so this is going to really kind of tie in here. Human is command. AI supports human decisions. AI supports humans decide. Okay, so how many of you have ever justified an AI generated shortlist after reviewing it manually? How many of you have ever adjusted an AI generated shortlist after reviewing it manually? You can just put your hands up. Has anyone ever adjusted an AI generated list? Okay, so the responsibility is the recruiters audit their tools, right? That's responsibility. So why recruitment is more complex now? So we're going to connect the dots. Transparency increased, right? We're going to take a look at why recruitment is more complex now. So there's that market pressure. We're going to really connect these dots on transparency increased, acceleration increased, scrutiny increased, competition intensified, AI amplified speed and volume. When all of those forces operate simultaneously, complexity increases. So this is not about difficulty, it is about variable density. So what is this concept of complexity? Why is recruitment more complex? It used to involve fewer moving parts. There was way fewer moving parts. Honestly, there was a telephone and a computer and some phone calls and interviews. It was way less complex than it is now. Now you have market pressures. You have compensation volatility. You have multiple stakeholders. You have technology tools. You have candidate expectations. You have legal and compliance awareness. So in previous cycles, right, previous recruitment realms, you elevated or evaluated the capability. Today, you're evaluating capability, your context, risk, timing simultaneously. And that's a real shift. And so when we take a look at all of these things, right, we're taking a look at where each of these variables come into play in every hiring decision. And variables further include, from what's on the screen here, right, which might seem like it's obvious, hybrid versus in-person, salary compression, retention probability, counteroffer risk, cultural alignment, internal politics, right? Maybe a candidate may be technically qualified, but high counteroffer risk. Things like AI and other complexities won't detect that. This is once again where your judgment comes in. So we're thinking about all of the things that really tie back into the sense of complexity. And I'm going to stop here and just to see if there's any questions or any comments or anything that anyone wants to put into the chat. Okay, so we'll carry on here. So modern recruitment requires a variety of things. So here's where we start moving into this idea of modern recruitment. And so if complexity increased, capability must increase. This is not about working harder, it is about working at a higher level. So now we're going to move through each of these capabilities deliberately, and we're going to take a look at what this actually means. So we're going to take a look at, right, going back through some of these things and what does that all mean when we actually break it down a little bit deeper. So what does that look like? So we're going to take a look. Oh boy, I don't know why that keeps happening. We're going to take a look at market fluency. Well, what does that mean? Market fluency is not knowing that the market is tight. This is not about knowing, well, it's a tight market. What does it actually mean? So market fluency is understanding salary movement, skill scarcity, geographic flexibility, industry volatility, candidate counteroffer patterns. I don't know why my controls keep doing that, right? So those are the things that really lead to labor market accuracy to really understand salary, skill, geography, industry, candidate counteroffer. So what this really means for you is to be able to say to a client in this segment, right? Right, in this, time to fill has extended by 20%, right? Time to fill has extended by whatever. I'm just kind of throwing that number out. Time to fill has extended by 20%. And we are seeing candidates expect hybrid flexibility as a baseline, right? So whatever that looks like, it's just being able to understand what's actually happening in the market. And that's just an example, but really having that fluency, taking on more of that advisory type thing, right, with your clients. It means speaking to the labor market language with a sense of authority and understanding. It also means understanding the client's expectations. And if the client's expectations are misaligned with the current market dynamics, that's where tension will arise. And so fluent recruiters interpret, right? Recruiters that have some fluency of what's actually going on in the market, it can really interpret the signals that can help them in candidate communications, in client communications. We're going to take a look at structured evaluation. What does that mean? So we've already spent a little bit of time in our first part of our session looking at the market fluency. Then we are going to lean into a little bit further on structured evaluation. So when pressure increases, the structure protects you. When pressures increase, structure protects. And the structured evaluation means consistent screening criteria. It means competency-based questioning. It means clear shortlisting rationale. It means documented comparison. So what does this mean for you? Overall, it reduces bias. It reduces emotional influence, right? It reduces inconsistency. It reduces liability. So instead of just simply saying something like, well, they felt strong, right? You're really based on your structured evaluation, right? They've demonstrated 3 of the 4 required leadership competencies and provided measurable outcomes in stakeholder escalation. That's just an example. I mean, it's obvious, and that's kind of like, I'm sure most people wouldn't say, well, they felt strong. That's sort of the extreme, but it's really giving a structured evaluation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Professional recruiters can explain the why they have put a candidate forward. They can explain the why that goes beyond what AI can spit out. So this here reinforces this idea of defensibility. Okay. Well, I don't know why my slide keeps going backwards like that, right? This helps to apply consistent decision criteria. AI governance awareness. So when we're taking a look at this AI governance awareness to expand on what we've already looked at, this is auditing AI generated shortlists, not just taking it at face value. It's verifying summaries. It's ensuring prompts are precise. It's monitoring for bias amplification. So this here, you're remaining accountable. You're in control. You're remaining accountable. If an AI tool filters out candidates who do not use specific keywords, and it can potentially exclude strong profiles, you are still responsible, right? So it's having that governance. It's really being able to keep authority with the recruiter, right? To stay in control of that. So technology, again, will support decisions, but it does not own the decisions. Right? So audits will own technology outputs only. We're going to look at advisory confidence. So the advisory confidence, this is where recruiters evolve. This is where we evolve from being talent finders to talent advisors. And so advisory means challenging unrealistic expectations professionally, clarifying ambiguous job requirements, reframing budget misalignment, managing timeline risk, So this is not about confrontation. This is about structured pushback. So here's an example, right? So given the current compensation data, we may need to adjust either the salary band or the experience requirement. Which lever is more flexible internally, right? It's really being confident to speak with that level of advisory. And it doesn't mean that the client's going to listen to us, but it's not just to give in, right? This is about confidence. This is about that advisory language. And confidence is not volume, it's clarity. Confidence is not volume, it is clarity. And so, what does that mean, right? What does that mean? This can help challenge constraints constructively. And then the last part here on what modern recruitment truly requires is a defensible process of which I've talked about. And this is where we're going to talk about what this really means for recruitment, right? Documenting screening rationale, transparent communication, ethical handling of disclosures, clear consent, consistent evaluation criteria. And so let's say if asked, you know, if asked by a client 6 months later, why was this candidate shortlisted over that one? You can explain it clearly. There should be no guesswork. It should be documented and highly explainable. And we are in a very high scrutiny environment. Memory is not enough. It's the documentation that protects you, and that adds weight. And so we're going to bring it together. Right? This idea that modern recruitment is no longer defined by access, as I've already mentioned. It is defined by interpretation. It is defined by structure. It is defined by accountability. And this is what really separates intermediaries from advisors. Okay, so that is an identity shift. Doesn't mean that the job you're doing today changes. It's how you shift it, how you approach it. So, what does that actually mean? So, what this actually means for recruitment is a few things. And then we're going to move into finding talent fast and go through some more engagement questions for the group. And so, if complexity increased and capability must increase, what does that mean for you at the end of the day? So, I want this to land. What does that mean for you? Recruiters must operate as advisors, not intermediaries, as I've said. Speed must not replace structure, right? This is not about speed replacing structure. The structure under speed pressure cannot be replaced, right? You can't sort of swap out a structure because of speed. It's how do you blend the two? Technology must be governed, as I've already alluded to. Ethics must be embedded, not reactive, right? Think about ethics proactively, not reactively. And all decisions must be explainable. So I'm going to ask you, and I really want you to think about this, and I'd really love for those of you who are on the call to type into chat. Where in your process, and maybe some of you haven't been doing this for 10 years, but imagine it's 2016. And this is not a judgment, this is an awareness question. Where in your process are you still potentially operating like it's 10 years ago, like it's 2016? Where in your process can you elevate an advisor mindset? Keeping structure, refining and tightening structure more so than ever because of speed? Where do you really govern how technology is really being used and ethics? So, what can that look like? Where in your process are you still operating like it's 2016? Policies and processes. Who else? right? This is good for awareness. So got 4 of you on the call. Love to hear some others. Where could you be operating like it's 10 years ago that could be elevated? Okay, I'm going to keep going. Again, it's great to let me know that you're there as well is awesome. So if you're there, I'd love to see in the chat to increase engagement as well, and it will help you to have things stick when you prepare for your exams. So finding talent fast. When we are looking at finding talent fast, we want to think about this idea again, speed without strategy creates noise. Speed with strategy creates placements. And so I really want to open the section by naming what recruiters might be feeling in today's market. Many recruiters are working at full speed, yet still feeling behind, right? And this is not a personal failure. It is the reality of a market where attention is scarce and competition is high, right? Attention is scarce and competition is high. And so this idea of speed with strategy creates placements. This is an anchor. So finding talent fast, speed without strategy creates noise. Speed without strategy creates noise, right? It can be chaos. That can look like a full in-mail queue, a high volume of outreach, and very few meaningful replies. Speed with strategy creates placements. Maybe it's fewer yet more targeted, more direct, specific messages. Maybe it's sharper targeting. Maybe it's faster movement because the right people respond. And then you set expectations with individuals as well. This is not about, in terms of the section about finding talent fast, this is not about giving you a list of different sourcing channels. It's a decision framework. So we're not doing sourcing 101 here. I'm sure you've all been trained and have sourcing tools and resources and skills. But this is really about that decision framework. So giving you a way to think so that whatever tools you are using, whatever tools may evolve in 2026 and beyond, your approach stays strong, whatever that might look like. And so before we talk about tactics, we're going to look at some context. And part of that is because if we're misdiagnosing the environment, then maybe we'll misapply strategy. So finding talent fast. Again, I'm going to say this again. Speed without strategy creates noise, right? If you're just kind of like going here, going here, going there, it creates a lot of noise. But speed with strategy creates placements. And so I really want to open this by naming what's really important to recognize. Finding talent fast is not just AI. It goes back to what I've already said. It's your judgment, right? It's your discernment. So not just pulling up a big list, but the discernment that goes into that. And so speed is a competitive advantage. It's not a convenience. Talent is widely distributed. Attention is not. Volume does not create quality, but strategy does. Right? So this is the anchor of what we're going to be talking about in this section. And let's take it beyond LinkedIn. So here in this group, so I want you to use the emoji chat, the emoji buttons. And with a thumbs up, who is still using LinkedIn today? I want to see by a thumbs up, who is still using LinkedIn today? Who is using LinkedIn for your sourcing and communications? Is there anyone that's using LinkedIn? Can you type into chat maybe if I don't see a thumbs up, yes or no? Okay, so you're saying no, you don't use LinkedIn. Brenda's saying no, Michael's saying, okay, so no one here uses LinkedIn. Okay, so what are you using instead? What do you use instead of LinkedIn? And so we won't spend a lot of time here. If no one's using LinkedIn, that's interesting. So I want to, this is kind of more of a reset slide then. Okay, I'm not the one recruiting. Gotcha. Okay. So deliver this is really about thinking about how do we deliver results? How do we utilize something like a LinkedIn if we were to use it? And I'm glad to hear that most of you say no. Unless none of you are doing any recruiting, whatnot, but maybe people in your team. LinkedIn is so saturated. We all know that. This is nothing new. Everyone has access to it. So the differentiator is no longer access. It is targeting logic and message design. That's it. And so when we take a look at the role dictates the channel dictates the message, and the message dictates the response, right? That's pretty straightforward when we take a look at that. And so when we're thinking about the fact that the role dictates the channel, and so maybe this isn't just for LinkedIn. Maybe you're on Indeed, maybe whatever other avenues you're using, in addition to your ATS and all those other things, right? The role dictates the channel, whatever that is. So different talent lives in different places. We know that. Even when people have LinkedIn profiles, they are mostly not engaging with LinkedIn in the same way that others do. The channel dictates the message, again, whatever channel, LinkedIn or others. A message that works on LinkedIn may not work in a niche community site, right? Maybe it fails over text. Maybe it just doesn't have the same effect on an email blast. So the medium changes the tone. It changes the length. It changes the credibility signals and what feels respectful. And the message dictates the response rate. And that's obvious, right? The response rate is not a mystery metric. It is a reflection of relevance. It is a reflection of how specific you are. It is a reflection of trust. And so we're going to take a look at different things, right? Where maybe trade rules, maybe community boards, maybe there's apprenticeship networks, maybe there's referral incentives, maybe those matter more because relationships and locality often usually matter more than branding. For let's say executive search, warm introductions outperform cold outreach because credibility and discretion are the currency there. Maybe for technology oriented roles, maybe it's Slack groups, maybe it's GitHub, maybe it's portfolio signals, right? Those will often tell you more than a headline because skill is demonstrated, not claimed. And so when we take a look at, again, to kind of close off this, and I wasn't planning on spending a lot of time here anyway, and especially since most of you don't use it, that's no problem then. LinkedIn is a tool, it is not a strategy. But what can we look at then as a multi-channel source? What does that look like as a multi-channel source? So lots of different things. So I've already asked the question, if you're not using LinkedIn, what is your primary go-to? And I love for you just to type into chat the number one that you or somebody within your organization or team might use primarily. Okay, internal ATS. Okay, that's ideal. Social media. What about the few others that are here? What are some of the other go-tos? How about for Lillian or Michael? Referrals. Okay, referrals are great. All right. So we're going to take a look at this example, right? So this multi-channel sourcing in practice. And so really this is where we're going to think about maybe different trade-offs. And I'm going to walk through this list or this table here more as a decision tool, but not so much as a list. And again, we're not spending a lot of time in this training today on how to source, but it's just about kind of revisiting certain mindsets. Sometimes people become complacent. Sometimes we always go back to what we've already done or always done. So this is just a little bit around opening up that multi-channel sourcing and practice based on different sort of avenues. And so the idea of the strategy that we're going to look at here. So we're going to take a look at example one. And so maybe there's different channels. So in example one, maybe we're looking at niche communities, right? And when to use it. So the channel might be niche communities. Maybe the specialization is really high. So think about where you might recruit or people on your team might recruit. Maybe some specialize in something that's highly industrial or highly technical. Maybe legal, right? There's legal, they're in the legal specialization. So where are those channels, right? The niche communities. Maybe here the risk might be low volume, right? When we look at this example one, maybe the advantage is looking at relevance is high and replies tend to be higher quality. So if you're looking at niche communities where the specialization is high, maybe there's lower volume of those kind of individuals. And then the advantage is there's a high relevance. And so maybe again, depending on the industry, maybe industry, there's those Slack groups again, professional association groups. Maybe it's local trade communities. Maybe it's alumni networks where it could be super niche. And then, of course, the ATS. Right? That is probably the number one best place to be looking at. And at times, I remember even when I was still in the company, at times that would be one thing that often we'd be trying to look for something novel, something totally new, and looking everywhere else, but where we could have started off with in the first place. And I hear that from a lot of people when I do training with access groups. And so your ATS, when to use it before you launch a new search every single time, right? You don't need to go through all of the other avenues first. Start with what you already have. That's going to be the surest thing. And so many companies have AI built right into their sourcing ATS tools. So every time. However, when is there a risk there, right? That risk could be outdated data. It could be old notes. It could be old phone numbers or emails, or you haven't had someone opt in recently to emails and you've got the Canadian anti-spam working against you there. Maybe people have moved, old phone numbers, so on and so forth. But the advantage is that when you do have those individuals, the speed versus warmth, right? It's like a warm introduction, a warm regroup. You have prior relationship, or maybe somebody within the organization has at least a prior touch point. So this is the obvious. I know this probably doesn't require a lot of explanation, but sometimes, right? We're really just thinking, and there could be multiple examples here. I'm giving you like two kind of one where it's super niche, where you're launching out to super niche communities where the risk, right? You're finding like it's the specialization is really high and there's a high demand and a low supply, maybe kind of candidate. And then example two should be the obvious that so many people forget to go to as a starting point because they think I need the shiny and the new when I'm going to do everything else. And so the idea here is that we're really thinking about how your database is your under leveraged asset for many people. And so why? Why are agencies underusing it? Because, like I've said, recruiters are often chasing new leads because it feels like momentum. It feels like the new and the shiny. But past finalists or those who maybe had a near miss, right, in terms of accepting a role or receiving a role, whether it's short-term, long-term contract, permanent, whatever that might look like, will often be the ones that can convert faster when we reapproach with respect. And so AI as a sourcing support. So on this topic of AI and on this topic of sourcing and finding candidates fast, again, as a reframe, is we've talked a lot about AI up until this point in the last hour and a half. And AI is now embedded in those sourcing workflows, right? It goes without saying. So the question is no longer whether to use AI. Like it's there. But again, going back to this idea is whether you govern it. And so I'm hoping to get some engagement. I know we've got a bit of a smaller group here, so it's a little quieter of a group, but I'd really love to find out what that actually sounds like for you. And we've already alluded to it, but AI is something that we govern. So what does that mean to you? What does governing AI really mean to you? So I'm going to give you a few seconds. I really hope to hear from you guys. What does governing AI mean to you? Managing the AI through prompts, right? Policies, processes, procedures, rules. Okay, so really following it, not just relying on it as the gospel truth, right? Really, really making sure that you're governing that. So I like those examples that you both gave. And so if you rely on AI output, which most will, but if you do it without that interrogation, not interrogation of the candidates, but your own scrutiny, your own interrogation, you are outsourcing judgment. Basically, what you're doing then is if you're not really interrogating that output, you're outsourcing that judgment to AI. And that's it, right? So let's unpack that, right? You are outsourcing judgment if you are not interrogating it. So, as I've commented before, AI is excellent at pattern recognition. It can generate Boolean strings, which is awesome. I remember back in the day when Boolean just became a thing, I did like a 5-week course every week on Boolean, and it was like such a big deal. Now, when I think about AI, I'm like, wow, don't have to know all that stuff anymore. It can summarize profiles. It can draft outreach, right? Again, it can act as that personal assistant and help with efficiency. But as we've already looked at, it does not understand why your candidates are motivated, right? Those motivation shifts in your candidate. It does not assess personal risk tolerance. It does not understand context behind a career move. It does not understand ethical implications of filtering logic. So let's look at a real scenario. So you prompt AI to generate a shortlist for a sales director role, right? Maybe it's a sales director role, and you prompt AI to generate a shortlist. And maybe it filters based on title, maybe it filters based on revenue metrics or whatnot. And so what happens, right? What happens to someone who scaled a division, but they didn't carry the exact title? What happens to someone who stepped out of the workforce temporarily? What happens to someone from an adjacent industry? AI is not necessarily going to ask those questions. So when you type in, right, sales director from the food supply chain or whatever the industry is, and you put in those filters, but what happens to all the others that it just dismisses? And so AI will not ask you those questions, so you must. And to bring in another layer, and a lot of this stuff is common sense. So I know that what I'm sharing is probably not new or rocket science. And so let's bring in the Canadian nuance here. Consent is contextual. Public profiles do not equal unrestricted use. Just because something is visible does not remove your ethical obligation to use it responsibly. So I'm going to ask you, what high potential candidates might your filters quietly exclude? What high potential candidates could your filters perhaps exclude? What high potential candidates might your filters exclude? When you think about that, what could that be? Interpreting the results, right? So it might exclude interpreting the results, or I think you put that in before. So what high potential candidates, right? When you think about candidates, what might filters exclude? For example, if I was looking for a sales director, right? Maybe it would exclude somebody that maybe had, was one rung below that, but ready to move in or step into a new role, or something was not on their resume, or something was not in my interview notes, right? What could that exclude? So just, you don't have to type it in, but it's just some food for thought, right? Really thinking about using AI wisely. That governance is important. It's not convenience. And so to wrap up this topic around using AI wisely is we're thinking about the kind of that idea of it as a co-pilot, not the driver. And so we're going to look at research. Again, it helps you synthesize job descriptions. It helps you kind of that competitor hiring trends even. It can kind of sort of look at candidate themes. It can create a sense of information digestion. It can refine, right? You interrogate the output though. It can refine it, but you interrogate the output, right? Does it reflect the true hiring need? Does it unintentionally embed bias? You humanize it, right? Tone matters here. So this is part of using it wisely. Outreach must sound like a human who understands the candidate's trajectory. So just a blanket AI generated message will lack emotional intelligence. And then last, really verify. So privacy, consent, defensibility. If a client or regulator asked you how the shortlist was built, can you explain it clearly? Can you be very clear on how it was built? And again, AI governance is becoming a differentiator as well. Because every company, every recruiter has access to AI. Anyone has access to that. Again, some tools are deeper embedded into your what you might have in your ATS or whatnot. But AI governance is becoming a differentiator, like becoming a more of an advisor, having more of an advisory position is also becoming a differentiator. So clients may start begin asking, how did you source this shortlist? Right? As clients start to recognize that recruiters are using AI to build profiles, to communicate with them, to use AI sourcing tools, clients might start asking more questions around that. How do you source the shortlist? How did it actually come together? How were each of these candidates chosen? Why were they chosen? What for? So recruiters who really cannot articulate logic will lose credibility, hands down. So the key thing here is transparency will protect your credibility. Any questions around that? Does anyone have any questions around AI, using it wisely, governance, recognizing that clients are going to start to scrutinize that even deeper as it becomes used more and more and more? So we're going to do a couple of quick extra slides here, and then we are going to take a break shortly, a 5-minute break shortly. And so thinking around here about outreach that earns responses. So candidates received constant outreach, as we've already identified, and we've also identified that most sound the same. So we're going to look a little bit around this idea of cognitive filtering. So when inboxes, right, their volume increases, candidates subconsciously sort messages in seconds, right? If their inboxes, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's just their email inbox, whether it's texts, however they're set up, whether it's in WhatsApp channels, whether it's in Indeed, or however you're communicating with them, different niche community groups, however it is, right? There's a bit of this cognitive filtering that candidates subconsciously will sort through them in seconds. And there's three like key triggers that will determine a response. So is it highly relevant? Is it highly specific? And is it highly credible? So we're going to break that down, right? A generic might sound like, I have an exciting opportunity. Great. All right. That doesn't signal much, right? It's a mass message, it's low effort, and there's no insight. And as I've shared before, as an example, a more strategic takes more time because you're not just sending out a mass message or copying and pasting it to a bunch of people. I noticed your recent work leading X initiative. That elevates it. What this signals is I've noticed your recent work. I've noticed you. I've researched you. I understand your domain. I am not just guessing right? I am reaching out to you specifically and personally, and here's why. So I want you to type into chat, and I'm hoping to hear from all of you. There's four of you on the call, so I'd love to hear from all of you. What changes, truly changes in the mind of the candidate from version 1 and version 2? What changes between version 1 and version 2? Interest. Okay, so Brenda's saying it creates the candidate to have a little bit more intrigue or interest. Personalization, personalized, right? Whenever I get an email where it's clearly been Chat GPT, it's like, yeah, I delete it. I'm not interested. Even if it's a really exciting thing, I'm not interested. But when I get an email where somebody has actually identified that they've gone to my own personal website, like my own for my own business that I run, they've gone onto my website, they've taken a look at what I've done, or they've looked at something on LinkedIn, like totally different. I'm like, okay, well, this person actually took some effort. Out of respect, I'm going to get back to them, right? And who knows? Sometimes it's led to really interesting things. Some of my greatest collaborations in recent years have come because of that personalization. And so this isn't anything new. This isn't just for the modern recruiter. This is something that's been discussed from time and time again for many, many years. It's just that reminder. And especially because speed and acceleration and technology and scrutiny are all merging, right? If you imagine that those circles or a Venn diagram, the more personalized, right? The more discernment that you have in your outreach and your communications, you will start to stand out a little bit more in all the noise of all the recruiters. And so, thinking around this, right? This starts early, right? This inclusivity starts early. And inclusion begins, right, at the beginning, right? It starts with the job description. And this is just one slide that we're going to look at on this topic, but it really begins at the beginning. And in fact, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, and you'll hear more about this in some of your other sessions that you're going to be doing. But this really also talks about the bona fide occupational requirements as well. And we'll take a look at some of these examples later on. But this is really where we're looking at the fact that inclusion does not begin at the interview. It begins at the criteria. So depending on your role, are you working with the candidates directly or with the clients directly? Are you working with both? Either way, doesn't really matter. Whoever has their eyes on that job criteria from the client, there's a scrutiny that we want to be able to give some scrutiny, especially when it comes to bona fide occupational requirements, when it comes to human rights nuances. And so the language and job descriptions and the criteria from the client and the job orders can shape your applicant pools. That's obvious. And it might seem neutral criteria, but it can also indirectly create a sense of exclusion. And so when we think about in Canadian standards, under federal and provincial codes, indirect discrimination often appears neutral. Maybe it's years of experience requirements. Maybe it's Canadian experience requirements. Maybe it's unnecessary certifications. So that might seem neutral, years of experience, Canadian experience, but they can actually cause a little bit more of discrepancy than we realize. So let's take a look at that example of the Canadian experience scenario. And so is that a bona fide occupational requirement? Right? So the client says they must have Canadian experience. Is it bona fide or is it a proxy for comfort? Right? So sometimes that local regulatory familiarity is job related, but most often it's not. And so if you take on a role as an agency recruiter, as an advisor, there's that deeper question. Whether you're working directly with, let's say, a business development person who's dealing directly with the client, or if you're dealing directly with the client, it's that pushback. What evidence makes this requirement job related? Like what makes this Canadian experience relevant? So it might seem, right, as a pretty innocent ask. However, is it bona fide? So that evidence makes this job, what evidence makes this job requirement related? So the key shift as an example here is ethical sourcing is preventative, not reactive. Professional courage here differentiates transactional recruiters from strategic advisors. So I just wanted to, again, right? So we're not going to delve into what a job order looks like and the contents of a job order, but it's really around this idea of exclusive sourcing starts early. Inclusive. I think I said exclusive. Inclusive sourcing starts early. It begins at the job description. The criteria shapes the applicant pools and the habits create hidden barriers. And we're going to go through some scenarios a little bit later in the session that will lean into that a little bit further and what you would do. And so we're going to wrap up some of this discussion about, again, re-engaging your hidden talent pool. And some of you have already indicated that your ATS is where you would go when you're starting a new search. And we've already looked at that as an example, like niche, the difference of going super niche to going to super obvious and what's readily accessible and readily available. And so before launching into a new search, looking inward, right? That's the easiest, right? Look at review finalists that maybe have already come up for whatever the role. And so again, why? And so why is this important? I'm going to kind of go back a step here before we go into that. But from a psychological perspective, cold outreach requires trust building, so that takes more time. Warm outreach just builds on memory. And we're going to break it down to those three areas of re-engaging your hidden talent pool. And if anything, if you're already doing that and that's a deep part of your already given process, great. So let this serve just as a reminder or further reinforcement that you're already doing what's highly recommended to do without having to engage externally deeply first. So, oops, here we go. Just going backwards here. Don't know why I keep doing that. So review finalists, right? Candidates who were second choice, maybe they often remain strong, right? So those who were second choice, they still remain strong. So go back to those finalists. And I remember for me, when I was recruiting, I was doing sales and marketing recruitment, I always felt like this pull to go for the new and the shiny and who else is out there and kind of go down this whole rabbit hole. And then it's like, wait a second, like I'm spending a lot of time trying to headhunt and re-engage and make these cold calls and these cold emails and all this stuff. When it's like, well, who already were the finalists in my previous similar roles? Who are the ones that didn't get that job, who were also really good? And I shortlisted them for a reason. I reference checked them for a reason. So why not go back to them, right? That just might seem obvious. Reassess the previous near misses. And so maybe they weren't finalists, but maybe they were near miss, right? Skills maybe have evolved. Market conditions maybe have changed. So going back to who's already there. And then segmenting by readiness. And going back and really sort of narrowing that down by scope, right? Not all past candidates are active. And maybe thinking about how can you categorize that? Are they ready now? Right? Who are the ones? And maybe moving forward, if you don't categorize candidates this way, but who's ready now? Who's open to discussion? Who has long-term relationships, right? So segmenting by readiness can be another way of really re-engaging your hidden talent pool. And so maybe an example here is last year you were, these are super basic examples, by the way, but last year you were a finalist or you were kind of looking at a similar role. I would love to reconnect. That's basic, right? That's just common stuff. Again, so letting this serve as a gentle reminder of going back to those people, right? It signals to that candidate memory, respect, the sense of continuity. So ultimately, kind of going back to that warm pipeline, it just reduces friction, generally speaking. So we probably don't need to spend a ton of time there because I think a lot of you have mentioned that you are already using ATS, or some of you mentioned that in the chat. But just as that reminder, like why it's so important to re-engage the one who you've already got or somebody in your organization at one point already reached out to. So we're going to take a short break here. It is 1:51 my time. I'm on Central Time. And so in 5 minutes from now, I'm going to call us back. And so please be mindful of making your way back. I'm going to do a bit of a quick check, make sure everyone is back on. So when I come back in 5 minutes and I'll say who's here, please type into the chat, I'm back. And then we will move on for the remainder of the session. So we will see you in 5 minutes. I am back from that short break. I hope everyone had a chance to either stretch your legs or get some water. And if you are back here, please just send me a note in the chat, just saying yes. And then I know that it's my cue to keep sharing. So thank you, thank you. Great, wonderful. You are all back. Much appreciated. So now we're going to skip into the next session here, which is that screening and that interviewing. And so again, as I've already mentioned, this is not so much a deep dive in how to screen or how to interview. I trust that most of you have some components around that already built into your process and your practice, but this might just kind of further refine things a little bit, or again, serve as a reminder on things. And going back to this idea that judgment under pressure defines credibility. Judgment under pressure defines credibility. How credible are we? How credible do we want to show up when we're working under pressure and we're working with time constraints and we're working with speed and we're working with technology and all of the things that I mentioned early on about what makes us recognize that, wow, this recruitment landscape is wild. And so it's that judgment that we put into place there. And we're going to take a look at a couple of things here around, well, what may be the quote unquote old model versus a modern model. And the old model, which I feel like I age myself when I talk about yellow pages and white pages and having those sitting on my desk at work, but it's just the truth. And so old versus modern, right? What was it like? And even in just the last few years, it has changed so rapidly. Everything, not just in recruitment, but from a technology realm, we know that, and we know it's not going anywhere. So how do we engage with it? And when we're talking around the idea of screening and recruitment, this is where the bias quietly starts to enter the process. And we want to reduce bias. Screening used to mean scanning for keywords and titles, right? It used to mean screening for keywords, screening for keywords and titles. Today, it's signal gathering, signal interpretation. So what do I mean by signal? Signal is the evidence that the candidate can perform the essential functions. So it's not just keyword scans. It's not just looking for certain things like that on a resume, but it's the evidence that the candidate can perform the essential functions. Now, where can some of those sources of signal come into place? So what can that include? So that can include the resume. It can include LinkedIn. It can include a portfolio, depending on the work they do, GitHub, Substack, I should say, side projects, maybe interview tone, maybe it's their response latency, maybe it's motivation indicators. So there's a variety of things that we might be able to look at as a signal. But why does this matter, right? The more signals you have, the easier it becomes to cherry pick what confirms your bias. The more signals you have, the easier it is to cherry pick what confirms your bias. So I'm going to bring in the idea of speed back to this. Agency recruiters are under pressure to move fast. We already know that. I don't need to remind you of that. You know that. You live it and breathe it every day. But again, as I indicated earlier, is that risk of it is that the speed turns into shortcuts. Sometimes shortcuts are okay. if they don't um, somehow alter an outcome in a negative way or a shortcut where something is not defensible. And so, what is the most common screening shortcut that recruiters might take? What is the most common screening shortcut recruiters might take? And I want to throw that into a chat actually. What do you think when you think about screening shortcuts? What could that look like? What could be an example of a screening shortcut that recruiters take? And they all do it. We all do it. I know I've done it in the past many times. It's not wrong, but it's how you defend what you do and what you recommend. So, what would be one common screening shortcut? If anything comes to mind in chat, what could that look like? Okay, maybe I'll give you some examples. Maybe it is overvaluing brand names, right? Meaning overvaluing companies that candidates may come from. Maybe it's overvaluing job titles. Perhaps it's eliminating based on gaps without explanation, not knowing. Maybe it's relying on this idea of gut feel, right? That could be a shortcut. Rejecting unconventional formats can be an issue. So when we think about this signal gathering, when we think about the old model of resume scan versus the signals that somebody can do the work and has the experience, we want to make sure that we really understand where those shortcuts might come in. So let's take a look at some other factors. So I'm so sorry. I'm using a new tool here. I'm using a new tool for sharing the presentation. So a long call, maybe an old method would be a really long phone call or really long screening process. Maybe now it's more of a newer approach, a multi-source review. Maybe that is looking at some of the other signals. Maybe it is looking at a short call. Maybe it's some internal communication, that dialogue back and forth. Maybe it is reviewing the resume. So there's other things. So it's multi-source, not just one long call. And then that title matching, right? It kind of goes back to that, just focusing on titles and not really focusing on the actual structured assessment. So if we're just title focused, then we're missing a huge piece of the equation on that real structured approach, on really making sure that we're evaluating all candidates equally, that one interview is the same as one person to the next person to the next person, that we're asking the same structured questions. We're using the same criteria for each candidate. Of course, nuances are going to be different and different questions based on their experiences and their backgrounds, but working towards the same line of questioning, not just title matching. So there's a lot of other nuances. And this is just an example. Like this is a very, very, very short list of what's kind of changed from the past to screening in today's recruitment market. And it's just really more as showing you some of those differences and highlighting some of that for you. So when we think about the what this really means at the end of the day, for this year and beyond, essential functions are not just preferences, right? The essential functions are not just preferences. They are the tasks that the role exists to perform. So I'm going to say that again. Essential functions are not preferences. They are the tasks the role exists to perform. And so if we ask the question, if this person cannot do this function, does the role fail? Right? So if you're asking that, if this person cannot do this function, does the role fail? Well, if yes, that's pretty essential, right? If the role will fail, if the person cannot do this function, then yeah, that's pretty essential. And so this is where we're looking at different things, where we're looking at also different kind of like nuances. And so when we look at different scenarios here, so I'm going to kind of pull this up here. Oh, I'm so sorry. So the essential functions, and maybe that's also looking at those who are maybe in a permanent role. Maybe it's people who are in a contract role. Maybe in those examples, maybe the screening differentiates. Maybe for contract, its ramp up speed matters more. Maybe stakeholder navigation matters more. Maybe if it's for permanent or direct hire, longevity indicators matter more. Maybe cultural adaptability matters more. So we're thinking about how some of those different formats can make a difference when we're thinking about the screening. What about that digital footprint when we're thinking about some of the nuances around that? Maybe from a digital footprint, we're looking at LinkedIn. Maybe we are looking at GitHub. Maybe we are looking at Substack. Maybe we are looking at different kind of portfolios. But there's an important boundary to be recognizing there. Professional signals are fair and they're protected, and the personal data is not protected. So professional signals might be fair, but protected or personal data is not. And I'm going to go into some of this a little bit more. I'm just doing this as an introductory slide, and we'll break this down a little bit further so it provides more clarity for you. And then the other thing that we want to be looking at is the defensibility. So if we're looking at first the essential functions, if they cannot do this part of the job, will the job fail? Well, that's pretty important. If we're looking at the format fit, right? Are they looking at contract? Are they looking at permanent? And then different criteria is going to mean different things. If you're looking at the digital perspective, what does that mean? But the defensibility, right? This is where things like a non-bona fide occupational requirement might come into place, like the Canadian experience, the exact degree pedigree, maybe the continuous career path with no gaps, maybe the overly rigid years of experience rules. So you're looking at how is this defensible? And that's really important to reinforce. If you cannot defend it as job related, it is a risk. And we'll go into that. And again, you're going to learn a lot more about that when you move through some of the other sessions that you'll be studying. And so this here, although it might seem like a really basic slide, the slide is really important. It explains why title bias is dangerous in today's world. Where again, for many years, many years, that's all that I focused on was titles. And then over time, it's become very clear that the title bias becomes dangerous. Job titles are inconsistent, number one, across industries. They mean something wildly different in one place versus another. And I don't have to tell you all that. You probably already know that firsthand. A director in one company equals a manager in another. In my company, I was the director of training and learning and development. I didn't manage anybody. I was a director of one, me. But a director at another company might have 50 people directly reporting to them. That means very different things. And then the other part is when we think about that is, well, what about the transferable skills example, right? A logistics coordinator might have deep stakeholder management experience, but their title has coordinator in it. A project manager in healthcare may translate well to tech implementation, right? So again, what about some of those skills? And then when we're thinking about defining trainable versus non-trainable, those are other things that we really need to be leaning into. Maybe the non-trainable, maybe those are the things like licensing requirements, core regulatory knowledge. Maybe there's critical technical competencies. But then there are the things that are trainable, specific software, internal systems, industry nuance. So when we think about all of this and we're thinking about our own screening and assessment, when we think about our own bias that can come into play here, we really want to be thinking around how do we broaden that scope? Because this isn't about completely narrowing down the pool of candidates. Well, ultimately that's going to be what you need to do if you're going to create a short list. But it's broadening the pool, but also narrowing the pool, but from a defensible way, in a way that's done responsibly and ethically. And so really asking, like, what are you labeling as must have that is actually trainable? And this is where some of that dialogue, depending on what role you're in, if you work directly with a client as well, right? That pushback, like what really are you labeling as must have that maybe is trainable? Can that be trained, Mr. and Mrs. Client? Right? Can that be trained? And so this question shifts that maturity level from only sort of taking the client at face value to advising and understanding what really are the true thresholds that we must adhere to, and where are we entering into potential bias because we don't want to do that. We're going to talk about some legal risks versus professional. And so when we look at legal versus professional ethics, again, I am only introducing this for you if you haven't already taken some of the legal workshops as a part of the CPC. But it ties in. It really needs a home here in this discussion around strategic recruitment and modern recruitment. And recruitment used to follow, again, more of a linear path. It really seemed that way. Today, it's so much more dynamic, as I've already expressed. Recruiters are navigating tighter talent pools, right? Again, tighter, while the wide world of candidates has become more open, it's also a little bit tighter at the same time. Faster timelines, right? The clients are expecting faster and faster and faster because we're promising them faster and faster and faster because of all of the AI technology. They expect that. And again, I've already expressed this and a couple of times, is the variables at every stage of the process has become so deeply nuanced. And this is where you in the middle, that professional credibility takes center stage. Candidates are not just applying for roles, whether it's a one-day contract or a temporal that they're applying to, or whether it's a long-term opportunity they're applying to. They are ultimately assessing recruiters, as we've discussed. They are assessing agencies, and they are certainly and should be assessing employers. So their expectations around communication, around clarity, around respect are much higher. And disengagement happens quickly when those expectations are not met. So we're just really thinking around here. And again, I'm not going to go into all of these because you're going to do that anyway, but it's just thinking about how it's this triangle, right? So legal compliance. Are we adhering to legal compliance matters, of which you will learn? Are we being ethical? And this is where the ethical responsibility is what we're going to talk a lot more about next. That's where we're going to focus on. But then protecting the reputation. So you're protecting the reputation of yourself, of your employer, and of your client. And quite honestly, the integrity of the recruitment industry. You're an ambassador to the industry. And when you obtain your CPC, you are upholding that even deeper as a brand ambassador for the industry as a whole. So all of this becomes really important. And so we're going to lean into this ethical screening and compliance as it relates to Canada here. And so as you can see on the screen, right, there's some examples around this. And then I want you to think about this as we're working through this slide. Where do you see ethical concerns or considerations that might come up? And I would love to have you share in chat where you may have seen things. And I can share some examples with you. I mean, I was in recruiting for 20 years. I certainly saw crazy things and asks that were highly unrealistic and illegal at times. And so when we think about this idea of shared responsibility, again, for yourself, you have the reputation of you, your employer, your candidates, your clients, and the industry as a whole. And all of us are kind of in that together, that recruiters really share a legal responsibility. And the client requests do not absolve you, right? So just because the client requested it, it does not absolve you from doing something. So, for example, I mean, again, it's been a while since I was in front of the client for that example, but this was many, many, many years ago. I was kind of well, not really. I was probably a recruiter for about 3 or 5 years. We had a new employee. I was doing some mentoring with her as she was getting started, and she was doing some work with me. So we were on the road, and I was a 360 recruiter. So I was dealing both client and candidate side. And as I mentioned, I was doing sales recruitment. And so we went to go see a client. I'm based in Winnipeg, and we went to go see a client, because they reached out to us and they were looking to hire a sales associate. I'm like, great. I brought the new employee along so she could have her first experience of business development, potential job order intake meeting. And right out of the gate, he said wildly inappropriate things to the two of us, just about our looks and our age and things like that. And then this individual, this client, proceeded to tell us exactly what he is looking for image wise, right? What this female candidate must look like, what they must wear, so on and so forth. I don't need to fill in the gaps. And here I am with this brand new person, probably isn't thinking, she probably thought it was weird, but maybe didn't realize the legalities around it. And I'm in this dilemma and I'm like, okay, what do I do? Well, it really wasn't a dilemma. I basically took my folder with my notes, closed it. I stood up and I said, thank you very much for your opportunity. But this is not something that is within a comfort level of what myself, nor should my organization represent. Um, Should your criteria change, please feel free to reach out to us. Even if he reached out to me again, I would not have taken it on. And he didn't. He was probably stunned. And when I got into the car and the new person who I was mentoring said, wow, have you ever done that before? I'm like, well, actually, no, that was the first. But unfortunately, it's a reality. And these are some of the tough decisions that we have to make. As much as I wanted that job order, it wasn't worth it. And so sometimes those decisions, so that goes back to that example where we share legal responsibility, client requests do not absolve you. So an example again, right? We want someone younger and energetic. So your role is to redirect to job-related competencies rather than focusing on age or energy. Redirect to job-related competencies. Let's focus on the specific behaviors you're looking rather than demographic descriptors, right? And so when we're thinking about the documenting bona fide occupational requirements, if a physical requirement is essential, okay, that's one thing. Document why. If a certification is required, document regulatory necessity. And if you cannot defend the criteria, don't apply it. By a show of hands, has anyone been, like a yes or a no in chat, has anyone been in a scenario where there has been a request placed upon you as a recruiter, business development person, whatever your title might be, where a client asked something that went outside of what would be a bona fide occupational requirement, something that could breach the human rights code? So yes, yes. And so anyone kind of have a quick example of what that might be? Like, what was the request? I've also had, again, please, I don't want anyone in childbearing years. Can't adhere to that. So I've had all sorts of requests that, I've had a client that says, we want to hire a guy's guy, someone that's going to come out with beers with us on Friday. Those are not, yes, only Canadian experience. And yes, as a sales recruiter, oh man, did I get that one a lot. And the reason why they would defend it is because they said, well, they need to have a roster. They need to come with a book of business, even if that was not essential. So those were the ones that came up often too. Okay. So just something to really be thinking around. And again, you're going to delve deeper into that. And for fun, we're going to do some scenarios um, of what that might look like. But before that, we're just going to hop into a couple of other things here. So candidate interview expectations today. We probably don't need to spend a ton of time here. You're all in the field and you're working with clients and candidates and going through it from every day. But candidates want interviews that respect their time, right? So we don't want to waste candidates' time. They want us to respect their time. They long, repetitive interviews reduce engagement. Now, back when I started, I was trained to have really long interviews, and I believed that for many, many years. But candidates, right, time isn't on everyone's side. And so repetitive interviews reduce overall engagement, but clear structure. So it's structured, it's clear, it's organized, it's focused, right? That shows that there's a measurable difference in how a recruiter operates. It's structured, it's organized, right? It's very clear to that person's specifications, their backgrounds. That can make a difference in an overall candidate experience. And the reason why I ask that, or I say that, is from my own experience. I've trained hundreds of people, I feel, maybe not that many, but over the years. And so many of us, and I originally started this way, and then I got trained to do really long interviews that were like super structured. But so many of us, whether it's interviewing, whether it's taking a client job order, whether it's a client meeting, whether it's anything, so many salespeople operate their meetings like a pinball in a pinball machine, just bouncing all over the place. And that can be a time waster for all. And so, why does this matter, right? From a candidate psychological perspective, when candidates expect clarity over complexity, they expect shorter, focused conversations, that clearly that two-way dialogue, faster feedback, because candidates interpret the process length as disorganization, which I came to learn the hard way. It could also show indecision, maybe internal misalignment, right? If the whole process is going on and on and on. And so here, clarity builds trust. And so, especially if your client's process is long and goes on and on and on, well, it's our responsibility to know that and then to communicate that with a candidate and not leaving them in the dark, wondering, why is this so long? So it's simple, it's basic, right? But clarity builds trust. Shorter conversations in a candidate's mind, maybe they respect their time, feels respected. It avoids repetition. Maybe that two-way dialogue, right? Candidates are assessing risk. And it took me years when that light bulb went off. I was like, oh, yes, candidates are interviewing me and interviewing the role I'm presenting to them. They're interviewing my client to the exact same level that that our clients are interviewing them. And Aram is saying it also shows that you are serious about their candidacy when we are transparent. Right. Yes. Very good point. That we're actually serious about their candidacy when we're honest. We should always be honest and when we're transparent. And so those are things that are really important. And what candidates are assessing, right, in that two-way dialogue, they're interviewing us and they're interviewing our clients. So, and we educate. I became really clear when I was training recruiters who are dealing directly with the client that they are educating the client as well. That when you're interviewing candidates, candidates are interviewing you. It's a two-way assessment. Candidates are assessing risk. They want clarity on scope. They want clarity on pay scale. Even if a candidate says it's not about the money, it often is, comes down to that at times. They want clarity on reporting lines, success metrics. The candidates want transparency on the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? What are the things within the organization that I need to know about? And I'll tell candidates, go on to Indeed or Glassdoor or whatnot. Make sure you do your due diligence as well. Faster feedback. Silence increases anxiety. Sometimes we're in it with them because it's out of our control when the clients completely ghost us. But the communication is important. Anxiety increases when there's a drop that the faster the feedback, that anxiety increases drop off, right? So the key here is that interview experience is employer branding in action. So the experience that your candidates have with you brands you and it brands your company, but also that same holds true when they're interviewing with clients. And so I'm just going to briefly run us through some of the different kind of interview styles that may work. And again, we are not going through interview forms. I'm not going to walk you through how to craft your own interview form. But what I am here to really encourage is I am a huge fan, and I always have been a huge fan on that structure, right? And having structured interview forms, making sure that every single candidate A, B, C, D, and E are getting interviewed the same way, the same questions. And of course, you're going to add nuance because one response is going to lead to a question that you can't have already prepared. But it gives a better assessment between one candidate to the next that also becomes defensible when you've documented it accurately. But structure does not mean being a robot. What structure means, it's being comparable. If you ask one candidate about conflict and you ask a different candidate about strengths and not about conflict, then you can't compare them fairly. You cannot compare them fairly. Behavior-based prompts are also really important. So I like to know in chat, and again, this is not judgment. Every company has their own processes and procedures, but this is one that I think is crucial to have defined structure around. Are there certain interview forms or questions that are maybe built into your ATSs that you are using as you're interviewing candidates, that candidate A, B, C, D, and E for the same role or any role are being measured against equally? So do you have interview forms? Do you have structured questions that are always asked of the candidates? And if not, that's okay. But let this be an opportunity to rethink that as a takeaway. So I just love to know, just so I know, I don't want to preach to the choir, but I'm just curious if anyone does have that high level of structure. Just a simple yes, no, no judgment at all. Okay, no, I do not believe so. Okay. Okay, nope, nope. All right. So that is some food for thought. And I'm missing when it comes to taking a client job order, but if there's going to be one form, one document or structure, and however that unfolds in your interview process, I highly, highly encourage having a interview form that each candidate basically has the same, not to be robotic, and it's not to read it like they're being interrogated, but that it's defensible to be able to say why candidate A was and B and C were put in front of the client, but not candidate D and E, as an example. And you can Google that and find examples of that. You can certainly put that into Chat GPT or whatever AI you're using and saying like, help me craft for this kind of niche or whatever your focus is. Behavior-based prompts are also really important. One of the things I'd like to train recruiters on is really getting good at asking your candidates, not just the where did you work, what did you do, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, so on and so forth. And I get every job criteria is different. Every interview style is different. Some interviews for some people is 15 minutes. Some interviews with candidates is 60 minutes. Again, there's so much varying. One of the things that I'm finding and I'm hearing and I'm seeing and I'm reading, and even more so as we enter this newer recruitment realm, is a lot of your clients are asking behavioral type questions. For example, right? Tell me about a time when you had to resolve a conflict between two teammates. So a weak question that we would ask a candidate is, are you good at managing conflict? That's not a great question. But a better question that's behavior based is, tell me about a time you've had to resolve conflict between two team members. What did you do? And because what this does is this tells the client about past behaviors. This is past behaviors of what they've done in the past might predict what they might do in the future. And our candidates often get tripped up on these questions when they're interviewing with our clients. They find them hard. They could talk about their resume, they could talk about what they do on their job. Maybe they could talk, well about their strengths and areas of improvement, but they have a harder time going back to the memory bank of behavioral based questions. Tell me about a time when. What did you do? So I always really have encouraged recruiters to tie a few of those into your own screening and interviewing with candidates so that you know how they might do in those kind of responses. You may be able to better prepare them before they go to meet a client. And again, depending on a role, some clients may or may not ask those questions, but HR departments are becoming and have always been, I think, really good at asking these kind of questions. And it's often the questions that gets a candidate confused. So I like to incorporate a few of those. Clear evaluation criteria, right? That becomes very clear. Maybe it's defined before the interview, right? Before you interview candidates, what does that look like? And I used to get so like granular. I'd have my main interview form, but if I'm interviewing candidates for a specific role, I would just add a couple of extra points into that form or into what's on the in my applicant tracking system if the notes are built right into there. And I would ask even questions that's geared towards that interview or sorry, that job specifically. And I might create a scoring example, right? So you might write this yourself as a note around this. So maybe you're adding a scoring example. So number one, maybe it's vague or theoretical, maybe three specific example, maybe five measurable outcome, right? I'm just giving you examples, but really defining what your evaluation criteria is based on the client as well, right? Based on the client's criteria and the bona fide occupational requirements and the job description and so on and so on and so forth. So that when you're interviewing a candidate, you can really defend why you have been able to select that candidate. And it helps you with that comparable decision making and it can help reduce bias, right? A good structure. So, what might behavioral and situational interviewing look like? Well, maybe it's looking at behavioral is it predicts the future performance based on the past. Maybe situational is hypothetical. So that could be the future. So tell me an example around that might be um, what would you do if a client was unhappy? So one is what did they do in the past? That can speak to past performance. One might be situational type questions. What may you do in the future? And then the reality is that both require structured evaluation criteria. So just really thinking about how do I create structure in my screening and my interviews so that I am basing the candidates fairly against each other when they are presented to the client, especially if you're using AI to help kind of create that shortlist and put your information together. You must defend it. Just a quick note here on interviewing across generations and formats. So different generations might have different expectations. Just going to quickly share this idea with you, right? Gen Z might prefer chat or maybe asynchronous video. Gen X might value clarity and autonomy. Strong recruiters will adapt the format. So trying to be mindful and keeping in mind, again, different generations might prefer different formats. Not saying that you have to completely change your process or completely change how you do things, but it's just being mindful of where you may get the best results out of the different candidates. So Gen Z, again, might prefer just to chat. Although I do believe we need to speak to everybody directly, but in your in-between communications, Gen X may value clarity. And so thinking about this not as stereotypes, but as communication preferences. Maybe the Gen Zs want that direct, that value transparency. Maybe Gen X values autonomy. Maybe they prefer that structured clarity. And so what's really important here is that the flexibility does not mean lowering evaluation standards. It's just trying to find a way to adapt your format to different candidates. So keep your standards consistent, but adjusting your delivery. And this is not sort of a session on interviewing across generations. That can be a whole other workshop in of itself. But it's just bearing in mind that because what may work for one candidate may not work for another. So allowing yourselves to be adaptable while keeping the criteria the same. And so I just wanted to pause here and just see if there are any questions around structure, about creating interview formats. Again, the good news, like I said, AI can help you do something that you can really refine. I went to coach somebody for 5 sessions on just his interview formats, so that they were just right. That was unique across any candidate, so the structure remained the same. Actually, his recruitment success increased significantly in terms of interested candidates, placements, as well as drastically dropping fall offs. So I highly, highly encourage that. Last thing on this topic before we hop into our one of our final sections is screening, testing, and reference validation. Again, these are the things that you're going to discuss in more detail when you think about legalities and ethics and other things. But here it's just that reminder that reference testing and reference validation and screening are all super important. It's important to remember that reference checking is not administrative. It is validation. And here's the difference. When we're thinking around reference checks, some clients will say, no, don't need a reference check. Well, it's always a good practice to do it anyway from a legal perspective. It protects yourself, it protects your firm, it's really important to be able to do that. And I don't know if you've already had the session where Steve Jones he talks about some examples of things that come up when references are not properly done. So I'm not going to spoil that for you so that you can hear it when he talks about some of those things. But if he still does that, so hopefully that's accurate. But reference checking protects you, it protects your client, and it protects your company. Even if the company says not necessary, I highly encourage that you still do that. And reference checking, and I know that sometimes there's fake references, so that's a whole other issue on candidates not giving real names and giving you a big song and dance why they can't get you names. But it's thinking about there's still a high level of importance around that. And it goes to that structured screening as well. That ties into that structured screening process. And when you're thinking around strong reference checking, it's really recognizing that questions that may be asked should really mirror the competency criteria used in the interviews. So when you're interviewing candidates, and maybe you're doing reference check on candidates, utilizing the same competency criteria that's been used in interviews. So that alignment is key. And really, at the end of the day, all that the references can do is potentially confirm patterns. They don't replace a structured assessment, but they can confirm patterns. Maybe they can confirm any red flags that maybe you've seen or that you're kind of wandering around. And so while sometimes reference checking might seem like it's kind of something that's not important anymore, there's a strong relevancy for it, especially if your contract with your client, your company's contract with your client promises references. I just wanted to mention that as well. We're not going to spend a lot of time really talking around the different testing tools. Every company has different tools. Your clients will have different tools, but just really making sure that when you have clients that are suggesting certain tools or certain kinds of checks, is there a relevancy to the role? Is it inconsistent? Are all the candidates consistently getting the same testing tools? And really wanting to make sure that there's that bona fide occupational requirement when it comes to any kind of validation that the client may be suggesting. And so we're going to spend the last 20 minutes here really talking about relationship navigation and ethics. And so here is really where we start to take a look at even deeper of what I've already offered. So we've talked about finding talent fast. We have talked about structured evaluation. Again, everything at a high level. And I invite you to think deeper about your communication with candidates, your screening approaches, your structured interview approaches. But now we're going to move into the space where recruiters can differentiate themselves on that navigating that relationship. And really, it's because recruitment is not only technical, it is so relational. And that to me is why AI cannot replace us. AI cannot replace the human element of where the relationship begins. This is really where judgment and courage and credibility, this is where it really determines whether you were seen as a transactional supplier for a client or a transactional person for a candidate, or are you a strategic advisor to your candidates and to your clients? And here we're just going to explore on how to present talent, basically strategically, a little bit around managing client objections, and then how to defend shortlists. And this really signals a sense of elevation in your approach. Beyond the resume, presenting with purpose. And so I want to ask, we're going to go through a couple of examples here, and I'm going to ask you, we'll go through some other examples that I'll show you, and I'll invite you to respond to in the chat. But forwarding a resume with a short blurb is no longer sufficient. That's when I learned, right? It was a short resume, short blurb, da da da. Clients are expecting a little bit of more insight, not repetition. Again, this is not new. I've seen this been happening for a long time already. But I just want to reinforce that a strong presentation frames the candidate around the business problem instead of listing experience, explaining relevance. But in chat, just yes or no, are you required when submitting candidates, typically speaking, is a candidate profile or a candidate like a breakdown of why one candidate is being presented to the client versus just a resume submission? So profiles or some kind of comparison chart, just a yes or no if those are usually tied into the submission of a candidate. Okay, so let's see. So no, only okay. So yes, 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 yes. I'm going through. Wait, I'm going down. No, so it's not tied into that. No, no, no. Okay. So basically, again, it really will depend on a company's process. It will depend on the discussions with the client, but it's not a bad idea to really being thinking around how these candidates are presented. And so instead of an example like Maria has 10 years of accounting experience, getting a little bit more granular. Maria has led onboarding in 3 similar organizations, is proficient in NetSuite, prefers 6 month contracts, is available immediately. She excels in transition phase environments, which aligns directly with your need, so on and so forth. So it's really thinking about just beyond the resume and presenting with purpose. So every candidate is being represented by you, your firm, to your client in the best possible light. And so when you're thinking around some of the ways to do that, it positions your firm as strategic, that the homework has been done. It hopefully differentiates someone who just kind of put a bunch of stuff into AI and then presented the resume with the candidate notes. It's really being able to show some of the things that that candidate can bring to the table. And so we're thinking around kind of that snapshot of what that person offers, right? Who are they? Are we hitting the bullseye? Are we really matching them with the client's criteria, right? Does that really align with what they're looking for? Are we showing any red flags as well? Are we showing the client? Are we being transparent with the client on if there's any discrepancies or if there's anything with the candidate, not red flag necessarily, but areas that they may need? Maybe they don't have 5 years of XYZ experience. They have 3 years, but they're highly trainable or there's certain things. And then the signals, right? Are we showing them that we've done our homework, that we've looked at the resume, we've done the assessments, we've done the screening, we've had proper structured approaches where we are comparing one candidate to the next. So those are just some things to think about. And again, I appreciate that everyone's processes and structure may vary and may be different, but there's some food for thought ideas around how are we building a strategic shortlist. So when we're thinking about presenting candidates, right, and really giving the clients a really fair bird's eye view, this again becomes more defensible. It becomes professional. It moves from just a resume presenter to a talent advisor to building a relationship and elevating that with the clients. And so maybe it's in a chart format, right? And obviously this would be a lot longer, but again, maybe it's really differentiating what that looks like from one candidate to the next and being able to sort of break it down and go, we've assessed all of these candidates based on the same criteria, the same questions, the same methodology, and here's how we're presenting them. And it helps you create that shortlist, like I've said, that's defensible, it's measurable, and it kind of takes away some of the guesswork on who to really present. And I'm not going to go through these. This is just more for example, but candidate A represents stability and enterprise strength, whereas maybe candidate B represents agility and alignment with growth. So maybe same criteria, but they're presenting it in different ways. So being able to have that conversation with the client, being able for the client to recognize what is going to align best, because no one candidate is the same. We can't present five identical candidates. They are all going to vary. And so how do we create that? Right? Maybe it's like this idea of the shortlist presentation, that it sticks, the client gets a chance to recognize the differences, and again, hopefully to mitigate some risks. And if anything, I think it just gives you a highly structured approach. And so the last couple of things that we're going to look at here is really going back to the ethics and compliance in Canadian recruitment. When you are working with clients and candidates, it's really important to continue to keep things in mind further than what I've already shared with you today. And so I'm going to show you two different kind of structures here. So there's two reasons why we're really looking at the ethics and compliance. Number one, it goes without saying it's critical, but we're going to look at commercial pressure. And then we're also going to look at under professional obligation, right? What's under your professional obligation? And when you look under commercial pressure, as we've talked about, there's that speed, there's client demands, there's your revenue targets, there's competition. When you're looking at professional obligation, there's the human rights compliance, there's privacy and consent, there's fair processes, defensible criteria. And so when we're thinking about all of this, right, ethics is not separate from performance, it sustains it. And when we're thinking about as recruiters in Canada, we operate in that commercial environment. We are also bound by those professional and legal obligations that are really important. And those two realities are not in opposition, but they can create tension, right? The commercial pressure is real. Shortlist deadlines, client urgency, revenue targets, competitive markets. None of that is unethical. That's reality every day, 100%. And it's only going to continue to increase. But for many, it does increase the temptation. It increases the temptation to cut corners to make sure that you get the candidates in the fastest. I get that. It does create temptation to overfilter, right? Overfilter and not really looking for the best candidates that are the best criteria, that fits the criteria the best. It does increase temptation to ignore certain nuances, and it can increase the temptation to comply without questioning. So let's think about the shift. The professional obligation in Canada includes so many things. And this is where, as CPC candidates, It's really important to recognize and to lean into this. Federal and provincial human rights codes, duty to accommodate. There's privacy legislations. There's informed consent. There's non-discriminatory screening. So there's things that we need to really be paying careful attention to. And I want to clarify that, right? Ethics in recruitment is broader than protected grounds. Ethics in recruitment is broader than protected grounds. So hopefully you're taking some notes. It includes transparency, conflict of interest management, right? Like that one client that asked me certain things. I'm like, well, there's different kinds of conflict of interest. It's your accurate representation of the roles for your clients, but it's also your clients having accurate representation of the roles to your candidates. It's not misleading candidates on salary. It's not saying to your candidate, oh, it's negotiable, and then it's not, right? It's not misleading candidates on a company stability. It's being honest if there's been a revolving door of people in that company and that there's challenges. It's being honest, telling them to go online and do their due diligence. And it's absolutely not presenting candidates without consent. So many times I have had competitors that have presented the same candidate that I'm going to present without them actually having had a conversation with that candidate about the job first because they knew timestamps. They want to get that resume in before I could. Not okay. And so here, this compliance is the floor, right? You think compliance is the floor, but the ethics is the ceiling, right? So as recruiters, when we're navigating candidates and dealing with our clients and representing our candidates to our clients and vice versa, the compliance keeps you out of trouble. But the ethics is what builds your reputation at the end of the day. And so this goes back to that example. If a client says, we only want Canadian experience, well, our job is to clarify that underlying need. Is this about regulatory knowledge? Is this about language? Is this about familiarity with systems? What is it? If it's not a bona fide occupational requirement, you redirect, right? Let's focus on the competencies required rather than geography. Can we define the specific regulatory or communication needs? So that keeps the relationship intact while also protecting fairness. So there's a variety of things that you want to be thinking around a lot. And this idea is ethics is not an add-on to recruitment. Ethics is embedded in every screening decision, every shortlist, every objection conversation that you might have with a client. And it is most tested in the small and subtle moments, not the dramatic ones. It's the most tested in the small, subtle moments, not the most tested ones. Any questions for anyone on any of that before we wrap up? So I just want to tie this all together one last time. So we talked about market awareness. So in market awareness, we talked about how this is information, right? We're understanding the market. We are looking at different differentiators as a whole on how we get to understand the market that we're in. How can we be strategic in how we're sourcing based on market awareness, right? This is kind of what helps to inform us. And that strategic sourcing, right? How does this feeds, right? Understanding strategic sourcing feeds the structured evaluation. So your market awareness informs your strategic sourcing. Your strategic sourcing feeds your structured evaluation. Your structured evaluation protects your ethical judgment. And then your ethical judgment strengthens your advisory communication, right? So again, you're not just a talent, and I'm not saying just, you're not only a talent finder, you're a talent advisor, right? It just shifts a little bit. It shifts that mindset into what can help you differentiate. When every company has tools to AI, They have the same candidate pool, right? Essentially, right? Any candidate these days can basically be found somehow online somewhere. So the pool's the same, but how you show up, your discernment, your judgment, your ethics, your reputation is what makes you stand out. So that's the integrated professional judgment. And where does that take you? Right? From order taking, right? Filling jobs, accepting requirements, avoiding tension, presenting resumes. That's a huge part of the job. But this is where agency recruiting becomes, right, that at its best at its profession. And this is where the advisor challenges unclear requirements. It translates market realities. It structures decisions. It protects fairness. It manages trade-offs completely transparently. And why? Because common failure points today, where we might not do some of those things, is where the pressure surmounts. The shortcuts happened under repeated pressure, and that's the real theme here. And you're not alone in that. The most reputational damage in agencies does not come from dramatic misconduct. It comes from small shortcuts repeated under pressure. So to close, technology evolves, markets will shift, standards are going to continue to rise in 2026 and beyond, and professional judgment is your competitive edge. So with just a couple of minutes here, I would love for you to type into chat, what's one shift you will implement this week, next week, when you think about the things that we have to cover today, and there's been a lot, and you will get the slide deck that will help you remember some of the stuff. But what is one thing that you can implement this week or next week that will help kind of lock in some of the learnings we did today? One shift. Mindset. Any others? Be a talent advisor versus finder. Okay. Well, as others are thinking about that, just again, this session is going to mirror the kinds of questions in this portion of the exam in the CPC. So once you get the slide deck, I hope that you use it as an opportunity to help you with your studies. And the CPC standards will reflect ethical recruitment practice, informed decision making, Canadian legal awareness, accountability to industry standards, professional courage. And so the credentials here don't just create credibility, but that consistent judgment does. And so everything we cover today is going to connect back to fairness, transparency, professional courage, advisory mindset. So thank you and good luck as you all prepare for your exams. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. If anyone I am on LinkedIn. I don't check it all the time, but if anyone ever has any questions or anything regarding some of the things we covered today that you wanted further clarification on, please feel free to reach out. And again, good luck as you prepare and study for your exam and take the other sessions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you so much.